Our last presenters are Ilya Silak and Cyril Sobolski. They will be presenting Queer Skins, a love story.
Yes, sound, definitely sound. I mean, not in my part, but in Cyril's. Okay, great. Hi, I'm Ilya Silak. I'm the writer-director for Queer Skins, a love story. So we're going to divide our talk into two parts. I'm going to talk about the why of our storytelling process, and Cyril, who's at the end there, is going to talk about the how of it, the technologies that we use to tell the story. So photography and recording encouraged. If you haven't had a chance to see or experience Queer Skins, it is an experience for Oculus Touch, which tells the story of a young gay physician estranged from his rural Catholic Missouri family who dies of AIDS in 1990. To give you some context for what I'm going to, what my storytelling interests are and how my artistic process works in terms of storytelling, you have to know something about me, which is a little unusual. I'm actually, in addition to making interactive stories, I'm a board-certified physician, and I actually work still part-time at Rikers Island Correctional Facility, which is a really, I guess, notorious jail in New York City. So my relationship to a certain kind of physical reality takes precedence in my storytelling. And with that, I'm going to start out with some basic propositions. This is a general different take on storytelling in VR. That storytelling is basically a way of organizing information, and that different kinds of media privilege different forms of information and cognitive processing, linguistic, visual, auditory, etc. So as I go through this, what I'd like you to keep in mind are two questions. One is, what information do you think virtual reality privileges? And also, in a relative unfamiliar medium, which virtual reality still is for most people, that has an uncodified language as of yet, we're all making that language, what organizes reality for the visitor in virtual reality? So before I say our take on it, I'm going to take you on a short, wild, incredibly quick historical aside, which I hope will be thought-provoking. So we're going to start with the year 1894. 1894 is the year that French philosopher Henri Bergson publishes this amazing little book, which everyone in this audience should read. It's called Matter and Memory, and in it he talks about the universe being composed of infinite number of images. And these images flow through us and past us, and they're stopped and held onto for two reasons. One is the bodily needs and desires, and the other is memory, which can override and overwrite those bodily needs. And the next stop is 1924. This is a year that F.T. Marinetti, who's the Italian futurist, comes up with this concept of total theater. It's not scripted theater, it's multisensorial, interactive theater. And it was something that Marinetti thought was an art form that could radically alter the way that people perceive the world. The sense that he happened to privilege is actually touch. So in the same year, he writes a manifesto, his manifesto of tactilism, which is in its own right an incredible document because it's a manifesto and it's poetry. But what really interests me is this last paragraph in which he actually talks about the possibility that there could be other senses, other ways of cognitively processing experience that we haven't discovered yet, but which certain artworks might actually be able to allow us to discover. And I think that it's arguable that VR may actually be that form of art. The next stop is 1931. This is a great book. So this is Jakob von Oskil. He was a German biologist, and he came up with this concept of Umwelt, which is basically environment. But what his understanding of environment was very different than what people were thinking of at the time. And that was that every organism, every creature experiences the world differently. And this is his rather fanciful illustration of how all of these different organisms might actually see the same scene. And he famously describes what the world looks like to a tick. And it's really, really great. We're going to skip ahead to 1951. This is when neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield starts to map the human brain. And what he does is he takes, he's doing neurosurgery on patients with intractable epilepsy, and the brain has no sensory neurons, so you can have people awake and touch their brain. He inserted electrodes, and he asked people what they were experiencing when he put electrical stimulation into brains, and he came up with what's now the famous cortical homunculus. So think about this when you're creating in VR. Human brains devote a huge amount of space to three things: hands, mouths, and tongues. I'm going to let you try and figure out what that means for virtual reality. Okay. Same year, Donald McKay, a British physicist, attends the Macy Cybernetic Conference in New York City. And there he has a big fight with Claude Shannon about the nature of information. Shannon wins. He takes subjectivity and meaning out of information theory because he wants to keep it quantifiable and mathematical. McKay, however, continues to argue that meaning acts as an organizing function for organisms, and he privileges the functional impact on organisms rather than notions of true and false. I think, given the political situation we have today with fake news, that McKay actually probably was right. Okay, 1991. This is when Varela and colleagues, Varela is a neuroscientist, publishes this book where he comes up with this concept of, or based on a lot of people's ideas, comes up with this idea of embodied cognition. And basically what he says is that how we've been thinking about human brains as these sort of computational machines which take in sensory information and then manipulate symbols and representations and then spit out commands to the body is probably way too simplistic. That the person's body, and not only just the body, but the environment, act as cognitive extensions for processing information for human beings. And the next place is a year later. This is a really famous paper now, but at the time it was published in an incredibly obscure scientific journal, having been rejected by Nature, which is one of the premier scientific journals in the world, as being, quote, not of general interest. So what are mirror neurons? We're not exactly sure what they are still, but what they basically represent is I'm up here gesticulating to you guys. There are neurons, motor neurons in your brain which are firing exactly that same pattern. So how that relates to notions of empathy, we're not really sure, although we could guess. But it certainly speaks towards this idea of embodied cognition. And apparently IBM thinks it might be important for robots too. Okay, so that's the end of the historical aside. I want to get back to these questions of what information does virtual reality privilege and what organizes reality for the visitor in VR. For me, and probably for most of you, the most impressive thing about virtual reality is a sense of presence, of actually being there in a time and space that seems unmediated except by your senses. So presence is actually, probably most people in the room haven't read the neuroscientific literature on it, but it's actually thought to be a primordial form of consciousness, one of the most early forms of consciousness, which helps us separate self from other and internal from external stimuli. Basically, interactivity in the world is critical for developing the sense of presence. We basically form a motor map of the world, and that allows us to plan future actions based on past knowledge. This, however, it's not just dependent on sensory stimulation and motor interactivity. Neuroscientists think that it can actually be influenced greatly by meaning, by emotion, even by culture. So if you ask me what information do I think VR privileges, I will say all kinds of information which lead to and expand this sense of presence. I am always thinking about, in virtual reality, how the user organizes space with their bodies. However, the language, it may be that at some point in time we can figure out and harness these senses, these other senses that Marinetti talked about, but for right now, in virtual reality, we don't have a set language. And we are borrowing signposts from other media to help our visitors organize experiences in virtual reality. When I'm writing, I consume, well, this is just me, I consume wildly, and these are all the mediums that I actually am influenced by. So I don't just stick with film, which is what VR is classically associated with. The bottom line is, if there's no universal code, no universal language for virtual reality yet, what organizes reality for the user in virtual experiences? These are some of the things, and Cyril's going to go into that more. So this is a still from our experience, and Cyril's going to talk in detail about why it looks this way. But there were three things that we wanted to do with this experience. We wanted to create a very familiar, almost universally familiar space of interactivity so that the story wouldn't be pigeonholed as just a gay story or an AIDS story. The other thing we wanted to do was to have a space and a form of interactivity that was very intimate. We wanted to give agency, but we also wanted to offer a sense of helplessness because of the situation that visitors find themselves in. And the last thing is that we wanted to really explore this tension between very specific historical embodied material reality and the desire to transcend that. And so we came up with this sort of magical realist aesthetic. And now Cyril's going to talk about how we did that.
Hi, thanks. So I'm just going to skip to the next one. I'm sorry. So all the concepts that Ilya just talked about come together really nicely in Queerskins. And Queerskins is an interactive VR film in which we combine volumetric video techniques with photogrammetry to create the interior of the car that you find yourself in. Video is a little cut off, but the 3D, to create the 3D car environment, a spatialized audio, 360 video, 3D scanned, historically accurate archival objects that you see that you can interact with, to tell a story of the two parents who are coming to terms with the loss of their son, Sebastian, to AIDS in 1990. This story is based on a novel that Ilya actually wrote. It's available online, and it's stored in a form of a diary that you can interact with actually in the experience here as well. And in the story, Sebastian's body is shipped to his estranged parents in rural Missouri, who've never really known their son, and now realize that the only chance to know him is through this box of belongings that was shipped along with his body, and the diary that they find. And you as a visitor can get to reconstruct Sebastian's life through your interactions with the objects that you find in the car as you ride along with the parents. This is really zoomed in. Oh, there we go. And so Ilya talked about the body as the kind of the organizing principles of reality and in this virtual world. So we really focused on choreographing the movements between the two actors that you see in the scene. And in VR, we read body language so much more than facial expressions. And in this particular experience, because you're seated in the back seat of the car, it became even more important to make sure that the actors communicate their feelings, thoughts, and support their dialogue with just the right movements. And Hedley Boyd and Drew Moore, who were our actors, did a phenomenal job in getting raw emotions across with just their body language. In the scene, which happens about midway through the experience, so there's a lot of emotional buildup that culminates in this very violent outburst that you see. You can see Ed has his arm up on the steering wheel, sort of subconsciously blocking Mary Helen from blocking the space, and then he yells at her and almost comes out of his seat almost like a wasp ready to strike, and she retreats back in to her corner. Of course, in that moment, the car also drives over the railroad tracks and rumbles, kind of indicating that something dramatic has just happened. Which brings me to the 360 video, which is another component that you see on the outside of the car. We shot over 10 hours of footage on location in Missouri and compressed it into a 10-minute sequence that serves as a backdrop to the experience. The 360 video was also given this almost Kodachrome-like a look with grain to get to this very home video type feel, which hits on another point that Ilya talked about in terms of the aesthetics as the one of the organizing principles for the visitor. It's really a trick to anchor the story in something familiar. And I'm going to switch to quickly. Sorry. Gosh. Sound is another element that has the power to anchor the story in the familiar, and I don't know if we'll hear the sound. We don't. That's okay. In Queerskins, visitors can create soundscapes with photographs that they find in the box, and we create these memory spaces where time is frozen, just like when you looked at an old photograph, kind of similar to what Derek was talking about in creating spaces to allow visitors to reflect on what they've seen and take a moment to consider the memories that they're presented with and what they mean to them. I'll keep going because we're running out of time. And continuing on a aesthetic thread, we worked with Peg Goodwin, incredible 3D artist who helped us create a photorealistic car interior that you find yourself in the experience. And we used photogrammetry to where we took thousands of photographs to construct a 3D model of the car that you see in the interior that really plays into the idea of creating this magic realist journey that you embark on when you put on a headset. So these are some of the stills, and the result is really stunning. It's 10:30, so I'm going to wrap up with really, I want to focus on this volumetric technique also that we used in creating the experience and sort of the overall look of the experience, and take you on this evolution of the look of the experience here. The initial footage you're seeing now is what came out of the cameras on set. So we previewed it to see how the actors fit into our low poly 3D car model, and we partnered with DepthKit to help refine the actor videos. You can see that the depth data is being processed here and getting cleaned up. We still have a fake car in here for positioning, but while the work on the car, on the actors continues, we're starting to add, in this footage you can see, we're starting to add our 3D model of the car. It's still unlit, but and you still can't see all the beautiful textures that you'll get on the final model. But here we are. We end up in this final version with beautifully rendered actors, finished car interior, and the color grade on both the 360 video and the outside of the car, to kind of bring it all together in this really gorgeously oppressive car interior that you really can't get out of. So I'm leaving a lot of stuff off just because of time constraints, but there are 3D scanned archival objects that I mentioned that you can interact with, just hyper-real lighting to create that magic realist aesthetic that we wanted to achieve. So we'll be in the Immersive Pavilion until 3 p.m. today. Come check it out.